The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered in excited clusters, cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Marcus Wellington, a wealthy businessman from New York who had flown to London specifically for this moment. At 42, Marcus was accustomed to getting his way in every situation, his success in real estate having convinced him that money could solve any problem and that his American status entitled him to special treatment wherever he traveled. Marcus pushed through the crowd with little regard for the families and elderly tourists he displaced, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the ancient stones. He wore a custom-tailored suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and his gold Rolex caught the sunlight as he gestured impatiently at anyone who didn't move quickly enough for his liking. His wife Sarah had chosen to stay at their five-star hotel that morning, tired of her husband's increasingly embarrassing behavior since they had arrived in London 3 days earlier. The previous evening at their hotel restaurant, Marcus had caused a scene when the waiter informed him that the kitchen was out of his preferred wine. He had demanded to speak with the manager, threatened to leave negative reviews on every travel website he could find, and insisted that someone should drive to the nearest wine shop immediately to purchase a bottle of the specific vintage he wanted. The staff had reluctantly complied, but Sarah had noticed the disgusted looks from other diners and felt mortified by her husband's conduct. Now, as the red-coated guards began their precise formation outside the palace gates, Marcus grew frustrated with his position in the crowd. He had assumed that his expensive appearance and loud American accent would naturally part the sea of tourists, but the British crowd remained politely unmoved by his presence. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, elderly couples held hands as they waited patiently, and tour groups clustered around their guides, all maintaining the respectful distance that centuries of tradition demanded. The royal guards stood motionless in their iconic red tunics and black bearskin hats, their faces hidden beneath the fur as they prepared for the ceremony that had been performed virtually unchanged for hundreds of years. Each guard had undergone rigorous training and had earned the honor of protecting the royal family through demonstrated excellence in military service. They were not merely tourist attractions, but active soldiers with distinguished service records, many having served in conflicts around the world before earning their prestigious posting. Guard James Morrison stood at attention near the front of the formation, his rifle held perfectly vertical against his shoulder. At 28, he had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before being selected for the Queen's Guard, and he took immense pride in the precision and dignity of his role. His family had traveled from Scotland to watch his first ceremony 6 months earlier, and his grandmother had wept with pride as she watched her grandson honor centuries of military tradition. The ceremony began with the familiar sound of military drums, and the crowd fell into respectful silence as the guards began their methodical movements. Marcus, however, grew increasingly agitated as he realized that several tourists had positioned themselves in front of him, blocking his clear view of the proceedings. He had paid thousands of dollars for this trip and felt entitled to the perfect photograph that he planned to use on his social media accounts to impress his business associates back home. Without warning, Marcus began pushing forward through the crowd, stepping on feet and elbowing past elderly visitors who had been waiting patiently for over an hour. A young mother with a toddler in her arms asked him politely to be careful, but Marcus ignored her completely, his focus entirely on reaching the front barrier. His behavior drew disapproving murmurs from the crowd, but the ceremony continued as the guards maintained their disciplined formation. Marcus finally reached the metal barrier that separated the tourists from the ceremonial area, but even this prime position failed to satisfy him. The angle wasn't quite right for the photograph he wanted, and he noticed that one of the stone pillars partially blocked his view of the lead guard. In his mind, he had traveled too far and spent too much money to accept anything less than perfection, and he began looking for ways to improve his situation. The security personnel positioned around the perimeter were trained to handle various situations, from lost children to medical emergencies, but they primarily focused on genuine security threats rather than managing entitled tourists. Marcus had observed their positions and noticed that there was a small gap between 2 barriers where someone might be able to slip through if they moved quickly and confidently enough. As the guards began their synchronized march, Marcus saw his opportunity. The crowd's attention was focused entirely on the ceremony, and the security guards were watching for more serious threats than a well-dressed tourist seeking a better camera angle. Without considering the consequences or the inappropriateness of his actions, Marcus ducked under the barrier and stepped into the restricted ceremonial area. The change in his perspective was immediate and dramatic. From this unauthorized position, he could see the entire formation clearly, and the guards appeared much more impressive and imposing than they had from behind the barrier. He quickly raised his expensive camera and began taking photograph after photograph, completely oblivious to the fact that he was violating centuries of protocol and potentially disrupting a ceremony of national importance. Guard Morrison noticed the movement in his peripheral vision, but maintained his disciplined focus on the ceremony. The guards were trained to ignore minor distractions and to continue their duties unless directly threatened or ordered to respond. However, Marcus's presence in the restricted area had not gone unnoticed by the security team, and several officers began moving in his direction. Marcus, drunk on his success at gaining access to the restricted area, decided to move even closer to the guards. He wanted a photograph that would show the intricate details of their uniforms and the intensity of their expressions, something that would make his friends and business associates back home truly envious of his exclusive experience. He stepped directly into the path that the guards would take as they continued their ceremony. The lead guard was forced to adjust his steps slightly to avoid contact with Marcus, a deviation from the precise choreography that had been practiced countless times. This small change created a ripple effect through the formation, as other guards had to make minute adjustments to maintain their spacing and timing. For the trained military personnel involved, these disruptions were significant violations of the ceremony's sacred precision. Marcus remained completely unaware of the disruption he was causing. In his mind, he was simply a paying tourist exercising his right to capture the perfect photograph of his expensive vacation. He had never considered that his actions might be disrespectful to the guards, the royal family, or the British people who held this ceremony as a treasured national tradition. The security officers reached Marcus just as he positioned himself for what he believed would be the perfect shot. They approached him professionally but firmly, informing him that he needed to return to the designated tourist area immediately. Marcus responded with the same entitled attitude that had characterized his entire trip, insisting that he had paid good money to be there and that he deserved access to the best possible experience. The conversation quickly escalated as Marcus refused to comply with the security officer's instructions. He demanded to speak with a supervisor, threatened to contact the American embassy, and insisted that his status as a wealthy American tourist should grant him special privileges. The security officers remained professional, but made it clear that he needed to return to the tourist area immediately or face more serious consequences. During this heated exchange, Marcus's stress level and blood pressure spiked dramatically. He had consumed a large breakfast at his hotel, including several cups of strong coffee and a full English breakfast with black pudding, eggs, bacon, and beans. The combination of rich food, caffeine, stress, and his growing anger created a perfect storm within his digestive system. Guard Morrison continued to maintain his position and focus despite the growing commotion nearby. His training had prepared him for various scenarios, but dealing with disruptive tourists was typically handled by security personnel rather than the guards themselves. However, as Marcus's argument with the security officers grew louder and more heated, it became impossible to ignore the situation entirely. The crowd of tourists watched the unfolding drama with a mixture of fascination and embarrassment. Many of the British visitors felt personally mortified by Marcus's behavior, while international tourists couldn't believe that someone would be so disrespectful during such an important ceremony. Children asked their parents what was happening, and tour guides struggled to maintain their group's attention on the ceremony rather than the disruption. Marcus's face grew red with anger and exertion as he continued to argue with the security officers. His expensive suit began to stick to his skin as perspiration built up, and his breathing became labored from the stress of the confrontation. The rich breakfast he had consumed earlier began to feel heavy in his stomach, and waves of nausea started to build as his body responded to the intense stress he was experiencing. The head of security arrived to assess the situation and found Marcus in full argument mode, gesturing wildly with his expensive camera and continuing to insist on his right to remain in the restricted area. The security chief's presence represented the final authority on the matter, and he made it absolutely clear that Marcus needed to comply immediately or face arrest for disrupting a royal ceremony. This threat of arrest finally penetrated Marcus's entitled mindset, but instead of calming him down, it triggered an even more intense stress response. His heart rate accelerated, His palms became sweaty, and the feeling of nausea that had been building in his stomach suddenly intensified dramatically. The combination of rich food, stress, anger, and now genuine fear created a physiological perfect storm. Marcus tried to argue further, but his words became jumbled as his body began to rebel against the intense stress he was experiencing. The security officers moved closer, preparing to physically escort him from the area if necessary. Guard Morrison and his colleagues continued their ceremony, but the disruption had clearly affected the precision and dignity of the proceedings. The tourists watched in horrified fascination as Marcus's face went from red to pale in a matter of seconds. His expensive camera slipped from his sweating hands and clattered onto the ancient cobblestones, the sound echoing across the courtyard and momentarily drowning out the ceremonial drums. Marcus grabbed his stomach and doubled over slightly, his body finally rebelling against the stress, rich food, and entitled fury that had been building throughout the morning. What happened next would transform a simple case of tourist misbehavior into an incident that would be remembered and discussed for years to come, forever changing how Marcus viewed his place in the world and teaching everyone present an unforgettable lesson about respect, dignity, and the consequences of entitled behavior. The moment arrived without warning, swift and devastating in its completeness. Marcus Wellington, the wealthy businessman who had spent his entire adult life believing that money could solve any problem and status could overcome any obstacle, found himself in a situation that no amount of wealth or influence could undo. As the stress of the confrontation reached its peak and his body finally succumbed to the perfect storm of rich food, caffeine, anger, and genuine panic, Marcus vomited violently and extensively all over Guard Morrison's pristine red uniform. The sound that escaped Marcus was primal and uncontrollable, echoing across the ancient cobblestones of Buckingham Palace courtyard with a wetness and volume that seemed to freeze time itself. The contents of his elaborate hotel breakfast, the full English with its black pudding, eggs, bacon, beans, grilled tomatoes, and multiple cups of strong coffee, erupted from him in a projectile stream that caught Guard Morrison completely by surprise and soaked the front of his immaculate ceremonial tunic. Guard Morrison, trained to maintain composure under the most challenging circumstances, stood motionless as the warm, chunky liquid splattered across his red wool jacket, the distinctive brass buttons, and the pristine white belt that crossed his chest. The smell was immediate and overwhelming, a mixture of partially digested food, coffee, and stomach acid that seemed to hang in the morning air like an invisible cloud of humiliation and shock. The hundreds of tourists who had gathered to witness the dignified ceremony of the changing of the guard instead found themselves witnessing something that none of them had expected to see in their lifetimes. Cameras that had been raised to capture the military precision and royal pageantry instead recorded the moment when entitled behavior met its most embarrassing possible consequence. Children pointed in confusion while their parents struggled to process what they had just witnessed. Marcus himself stood frozen in horror, his mouth hanging open as he realized the magnitude of what had just occurred. The vomit had not been a small, discreet incident that might have been overlooked or forgiven. It had been extensive, violent, and impossible to ignore. Guard Morrison's uniform, which represented centuries of military tradition and had been prepared with meticulous care that morning, was now soaked with the revolting evidence of Marcus's poor choices and entitled attitude. The security officers who had been attempting to remove Marcus from the restricted area found themselves dealing with a situation for which their training had not specifically prepared them. While they had protocols for handling disruptive tourists, medical emergencies, and even potential security threats, the scenario of a wealthy American businessman vomiting on a Royal Guard's ceremonial uniform fell into uncharted territory. Guard Morrison's fellow guardsmen maintained their positions and continued the ceremony as best they could, their military training overriding the natural human impulse to react with disgust or sympathy for their colleague. However, the formation had been irreparably disrupted, and the dignity of the proceedings had been compromised in a way that would require immediate attention from senior military and palace officials. The crowd's reaction evolved from shocked silence to a mixture of gasps, nervous laughter, and uncomfortable murmuring as people struggled to process what they had witnessed. Some tourists continued filming, recognizing that they had captured something unprecedented, while others lowered their cameras out of respect for Guard Morrison's dignity. Tour guides attempted to redirect their group's attention, But the incident had become the unavoidable focal point of the morning's events. Marcus finally found his voice and began stammering apologies, but his words seemed pathetically inadequate given the scope of what had occurred. He reached toward Guard Morrison as if to somehow clean or fix the uniform, but the security officers quickly intervened, preventing any further contact between the disgraced tourist and the professional soldier who had become the victim of his entitled behavior and poor impulse control. The smell continued to intensify as the morning sun warmed the ancient stones and the vomit that had splashed beyond Guard Morrison's uniform. Palace maintenance staff appeared with cleaning equipment, their faces grim as they began the process of sanitizing the ceremonial area while the interrupted ceremony continued around them. The contrast between the dignity of the ongoing military pageantry and the revolting cleanup operation created a surreal scene that none of the witnesses would ever forget. Senior palace officials and military commanders received immediate notification of the incident through their communication systems. An event of this nature, occurring during a public ceremony and involving a royal guard, required rapid response and careful management to minimize damage to the institution's reputation and to ensure proper care for the affected guardsmen. Guard Morrison, despite the humiliating circumstances, maintained his military bearing and continued to stand at attention until formally relieved of his duties by a commanding officer who had rushed to the scene. The relief came within minutes, but those minutes felt like hours as Morrison stood soaked in vomit while tourists continued to observe and photograph the aftermath of Marcus's spectacular lack of self-control. Medical personnel arrived to assess both Marcus and Guard Morrison, though their priorities were clearly different. Marcus, having emptied his stomach violently, was pale and shaking from the physical and emotional trauma of what had occurred. Guard Morrison, while physically unharmed, had been exposed to potentially infectious bodily fluids and required immediate attention to ensure his health and safety. The ceremonial area was cordoned off as cleaning crews worked to remove all traces of the incident from the historic cobblestones. The irony was not lost on observers that stones which had witnessed centuries of royal ceremonies, military triumphs, and moments of national importance were now being scrubbed clean of tourist vomit by palace maintenance staff, wearing protective gloves and face masks. Marcus's expensive camera lay forgotten on the ground where it had fallen, its lens cracked from the impact with the ancient stones. The device that he had been so desperate to use for the perfect photograph now served as a symbol of how his entitled pursuit of the ideal vacation experience had led to the most humiliating moment of his adult life. The security team faced the complex task of deciding how to handle Marcus's continued presence at the palace. While vomiting on a royal guard was certainly unprecedented, it wasn't necessarily a criminal offense, particularly if it had been involuntary. However, his initial disruption of the ceremony, his refusal to comply with security instructions, and his unauthorized entry into a restricted area represented clear violations that could not be overlooked. News of the incident began spreading immediately through social media as tourists shared videos and photographs of what they had witnessed. The hashtag #VomitGate began trending within hours as people around the world reacted with disbelief, humor, and disgust to the unprecedented breach of royal protocol. Marcus's expensive suit and obvious wealth made him an easy target for social media commentary about entitled tourists and ugly American behavior. Palace press officers found themselves in the unusual position of crafting statements about an incident that had no precedent in the modern era of royal ceremony management. The challenge was to acknowledge what had occurred while maintaining the dignity of the institution and protecting the privacy of the individuals involved, particularly Guard Morrison, who had been the innocent victim of Marcus's spectacular public breakdown. Guard Morrison was escorted to private facilities where he could clean himself and change into a fresh uniform. The process was thorough and methodical, as military protocol required complete sanitization following exposure to bodily fluids from an unknown individual. Medical personnel examined him for any signs of contamination or infection, while senior officers debriefed him about the incident to ensure accurate records for future reference. The ruined ceremonial uniform represented more than just clothing. It was a symbol of military honor and royal tradition that had been desecrated by tourist entitlement. The red wool tunic, with its gold braiding and brass buttons, would need to be professionally cleaned and restored if possible, or replaced entirely if the contamination proved too extensive for salvage. Marcus found himself in a palace security office, still pale and shaking from the physical and emotional trauma of what had occurred. The reality of his situation was beginning to penetrate his entitled mindset as he realized that his actions had consequences that extended far beyond his personal embarrassment. He had disrupted a royal ceremony, violated palace security protocols, and committed an act so unprecedented that officials were unsure how to proceed. The international implications of the incident became clear as news outlets around the world picked up the story of the American tourist who had vomited on a royal guard at Buckingham Palace. The story had everything that modern media craved: wealth, entitlement, embarrassment, and the violation of sacred traditions in one of the world's most prestigious locations. Sarah Wellington received the news of her husband's disgrace through a frantic phone call from palace security, and she immediately rushed from their luxury hotel to deal with the crisis. Her embarrassment was profound and complete as she realized that Marcus's behavior had escalated from merely rude and entitled to internationally newsworthy humiliation. The cleaning crews worked tirelessly to restore the ceremonial area to its pristine condition, but the memory of what had occurred would linger far longer than any physical evidence. The ancient stones had witnessed many historical moments, but few as ignominious as a wealthy tourist's complete breakdown in the face of reasonable security measures. Palace officials recognized that the incident would require careful handling to prevent it from overshadowing the dignity and significance of royal ceremonies. The challenge was to address the unprecedented breach of protocol while maintaining the institution's reputation for grace and professionalism in the face of even the most embarrassing circumstances. As the immediate crisis management began, it became clear that the consequences of Marcus's entitled behavior would extend far beyond the moment of humiliation. The incident would trigger a series of events that would transform not only his own life, but also the lives of everyone who had witnessed his spectacular fall from grace to disgrace. Within 30 minutes of the incident, the video footage captured by dozens of tourists had begun its viral journey across every major social media platform on Earth. The crystal-clear recordings showed Marcus Wellington in his expensive suit pushing through the crowd, arguing with security officers, and then projectile vomiting across Guard Morrison's pristine red uniform with a violence and completeness that seemed almost impossible to believe. The hashtag Buckingham Vomit joined hashtag VomitGate and hashtag Entitled Tourist as millions of people around the world shared, commented, and reacted to what was quickly being called the most embarrassing tourist incident in royal history. The videos were viewed over 50 million times in the first 6 hours alone, with reaction videos, memes, and commentary pieces spreading across platforms faster than palace officials could track. Inside the palace security office, Marcus sat in a hard wooden chair, still pale and trembling from the physical and emotional trauma of what had occurred. His expensive suit was stained with his own vomit, his hands shook uncontrollably, and his mind struggled to process the magnitude of his public humiliation. The entitled businessman who had arrived in London believing that his wealth granted him special privileges now faced the reality that money could not undo what had been captured on dozens of cameras and shared with the entire world. Palace Press Secretary Amanda Hartwell found herself managing a crisis unlike any in her 15-year career. The royal family's communication strategy typically dealt with matters of state, diplomatic relations, and carefully orchestrated public appearances, not unprecedented incidents involving American tourists and bodily fluids. Her team worked frantically to craft statements that would address the incident while maintaining the dignity of both the institution and the individuals involved. The international media response was swift and merciless. British tabloids led with headlines like "Sick Tourists' Royal Mess" and "Americans' Palace Puke Shock," while American news outlets struggled to balance their coverage between embarrassment at Marcus's behavior and criticism of what they portrayed as overly rigid British protocol. The incident became a cultural flashpoint for discussions about tourist behavior, national stereotypes, and respect for foreign traditions. Guard Morrison, meanwhile, had undergone a thorough medical examination and decontamination process in a private facility within the palace complex. Military medical personnel tested his blood, examined his skin for any signs of contamination, and provided him with preventive medications as a precaution against potential infections. The psychological impact of the incident was also being addressed, as counselors recognized that being vomited on during a ceremonial duty represented a unique form of professional humiliation. The social media reaction evolved rapidly from initial shock and disbelief to creative commentary and humor. Memes featuring Marcus's face appeared within hours, with captions mocking entitled tourist behavior and American stereotypes. The incident became a symbol for everything that people disliked about wealthy tourists who believed their money entitled them to special treatment and exemption from local customs and laws. Sarah Wellington arrived at the palace in a state of complete mortification, her face red with embarrassment as she realized that her husband's behavior had become international news. The elegant woman who had married Marcus for his success and confidence now found herself associated with one of the most humiliating tourist incidents in modern history. She was escorted through back entrances to avoid the growing crowd of reporters and photographers who had gathered outside the main gates. The palace's senior management team convened an emergency meeting to determine how to handle the unprecedented situation. While they had protocols for managing various types of incidents during royal ceremonies, nothing in their extensive procedures manual addressed the scenario of a tourist vomiting on a guardsman. Legal experts were consulted to determine whether Marcus had committed any actual crimes beyond the obvious breach of protocol and dignity. Marcus himself remained in a state of shock as palace officials explained the severity of his situation. His disruption of the changing of the guard ceremony represented a breach of public order. His unauthorized entry into a restricted area violated security protocols, and his refusal to comply with lawful instructions from security officers constituted additional offenses. However, the vomiting incident itself, being involuntary, fell into a legal gray area that required careful consideration. The global reaction revealed deep cultural divisions about tourist behavior and national responsibility. British commentators expressed outrage at what they saw as typical American entitlement and disrespect for tradition, while some American voices defended Marcus as a victim of overly aggressive security measures and rigid protocol. The incident became a Rorschach test for people's attitudes about wealth, privilege, tourism, and cultural respect. Professional crisis management experts began offering their services to Marcus through intermediaries, recognizing that his situation required immediate and sophisticated damage control. His real estate business back in New York was already receiving negative calls and emails from people who had seen the viral videos, and his professional reputation was under assault from multiple directions simultaneously. The cleaning and restoration of Guard Morrison's ceremonial uniform became a meticulous process overseen by the palace's most experienced textile specialists. The red wool tunic with its gold braiding and brass buttons represented not just clothing but centuries of military tradition and royal protocol. Every effort would be made to restore the uniform to its original condition, but the symbolic damage to its dignity could never be completely erased. Palace security reviewed their protocols in light of the incident, recognizing that while they had successfully prevented any actual security threats, they had failed to anticipate the potential for tourist behavior to escalate to such an unprecedented level of disruption. The incident highlighted the challenge of maintaining open access for tourists while preserving the dignity and security of royal ceremonies. The British public's reaction was overwhelmingly negative toward Marcus, with particular criticism focused on his apparent belief that his wealth and nationality entitled him to special treatment. The incident reinforced negative stereotypes about American tourists that many Britons had hoped were becoming outdated, and social media was filled with expressions of sympathy for Guard Morrison and anger at Marcus's behavior. International diplomatic implications began to emerge as the incident became a symbol for broader cultural tensions between Americans and Europeans regarding respect for tradition and authority. While the U.S. Embassy in London issued a diplomatic statement expressing regret for the incident, they also had to balance their response to avoid implying that Marcus's behavior was representative of all American tourists. Marcus's business associates in New York began distancing themselves from him as the viral videos made international news. Real estate deals worth millions of dollars were quietly put on hold as potential partners worried about the negative publicity associated with Marcus's name. His professional network, built over decades of successful business relationships, began to crumble under the weight of global humiliation. The psychological impact on Marcus became increasingly severe as he realized that the incident would follow him for the rest of his life. In an age of permanent digital records and social media, his moment of spectacular bad judgment and its consequences had been preserved forever for anyone to see. The entitled businessman who had believed himself above consequences found himself facing the ultimate accountability. Guard Morrison's family in Scotland watched the news coverage with a mixture of pride in his professional composure and anger at the disrespect he had suffered. His grandmother, who had wept with joy at his first ceremony, now wept again but from outrage at seeing her grandson humiliated by a tourist's entitled behavior. The incident had transformed what should have been a proud moment of military service into a source of family trauma. The palace's legal team worked to determine what consequences Marcus would face for his actions. While the vomiting itself was involuntary and therefore not criminal, his initial disruption of the ceremony, unauthorized entry into a restricted area, and refusal to comply with security instructions represented clear violations that required formal response. The challenge was to impose appropriate consequences while avoiding actions that might further escalate the international attention. Social media influencers and content creators quickly capitalized on the incident, creating reaction videos, commentary pieces, and satirical content that further amplified the story's reach. The incident became a template for discussing entitled tourist behavior, with Marcus serving as the ultimate example of what not to do when visiting foreign countries and cultural sites. The incident also sparked broader conversations about the accessibility and management of royal ceremonies and historical sites. While most people supported maintaining appropriate security and protocol, some questioned whether the current system adequately balanced public access with the preservation of dignity and tradition. Marcus's behavior, while inexcusable, had highlighted potential gaps in crowd management and tourist education. As the first day after the incident concluded, it became clear that the consequences for Marcus would extend far beyond his immediate embarrassment. His actions had created a perfect storm of cultural, diplomatic, professional, and personal repercussions that would reshape his life and serve as a cautionary tale for entitled tourists everywhere. The man who had believed that wealth could solve any problem now faced challenges that money could not address and humiliation that could not be undone. 3 days after the incident that had made Marcus Wellington globally infamous, an unexpected development emerged that would completely transform the narrative from a simple story of tourist entitlement into something far more complex and emotionally powerful. Guard James Morrison, the professional soldier who had maintained his composure while being humiliated in front of hundreds of witnesses, requested a private meeting with palace officials to discuss his response to the unprecedented situation. The meeting took place in a quiet office within the palace complex, attended by Morrison's commanding officer, a palace official, and a military counselor. What Morrison revealed during that meeting shocked everyone present and would soon shock the world. The composed guardsman, who had stood at attention while soaked in vomit, broke down in tears as he explained the personal significance of what had occurred during that ceremony. Morrison revealed that the ceremony during which Marcus had vomited on him was scheduled to be his final performance as a royal guard. After 6 years of distinguished service, including combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, he had been diagnosed with a rare neurological condition that would slowly rob him of his motor control and eventually end his military career. The doctors had given him perhaps 6 more months of active duty before the symptoms would become too severe to continue serving. The changing of the guard ceremony on that fateful morning had been Morrison's personal farewell to a career that had defined his adult life and fulfilled his childhood dreams of serving his country and monarchy. His family from Scotland, including his elderly grandmother who had inspired his military service with stories of her late husband's service in World War II, had planned to attend what they believed would be many more ceremonies, but which Morrison knew would be among his last. Morrison's grandmother, Helen Morrison, was 87 years old and had been saving her pension money for months to make the trip from her small Highland village to London. She had wanted to see her grandson perform his duties one final time before her own advancing age made travel impossible. The ceremony was meant to be a celebration of family pride and military tradition, a moment that would sustain her through the difficult years ahead as her grandson's health declined. Instead, she had been forced to watch from the crowd as her grandson stood motionless while being covered in vomit by a wealthy tourist who had shown complete disregard for the ceremony's significance and dignity. The image of her proud grandson, representing everything she valued about duty and honor, being humiliated by Marcus's entitled behavior had traumatized the elderly woman and left her questioning whether the world she had known and valued still existed. This revelation transformed the public perception of the incident from a story about an entitled tourist getting his comeuppance into a tragedy about a dying soldier's final moment of dignity being destroyed by thoughtless selfishness. When Morrison's commanding officer learned about the personal significance of the ceremony, he immediately began working with palace officials to determine how they might address the profound injustice that had occurred. The palace's response was swift and unprecedented. Queen Elizabeth herself was briefed on Morrison's situation and his request for a private ceremony that might restore some dignity to his final weeks of service. The monarch, known for her deep respect for military service and her understanding of duty and sacrifice, personally approved an extraordinary private ceremony that would be attended only by Morrison's family and select palace officials. Meanwhile, Marcus remained in London, trapped by the international media attention that made it impossible for him to leave without facing a gauntlet of cameras and hostile questions. His luxury hotel had become a prison as reporters and photographers maintained constant surveillance of the entrances. His attempts to book flights back to New York were frustrated by airline officials who worried about the potential disruption his presence might cause among passengers who recognized him from the viral videos. The news of Morrison's medical condition and the personal significance of the ruined ceremony began to leak through social media and military channels. When the full story emerged, the public reaction was swift and devastating for Marcus. The narrative shifted from a wealthy tourist getting embarrassed to a dying soldier having his final moment of honor destroyed by selfish entitlement. Sarah Wellington, already mortified by her husband's behavior, found herself facing an even more complex emotional situation as she learned about the true impact of his actions. The elegant socialite who had married Marcus for his confidence and success now realized that his behavior had caused genuine harm to a heroic individual who deserved respect and honor, not humiliation and trauma. The viral videos took on a completely different meaning as people understood that they were watching not just tourist misbehavior, but the destruction of a dying soldier's farewell ceremony. Comment sections that had been filled with jokes and memes about Marcus's humiliation now overflowed with expressions of sympathy for Morrison and anger at the deeper injustice that had occurred. Morrison's fellow guardsmen, who had maintained their professional composure during the original incident, now struggled with their own emotional responses as they learned about their colleague's situation. The military brotherhood that bound them together made Morrison's personal tragedy their collective concern, and they began organizing their own tribute to honor his service and sacrifice. Marcus, learning about Morrison's condition through his legal representatives, experienced a crushing realization that his actions had consequences far beyond his own embarrassment. The entitled businessman who had believed that his problems were the most important thing in any situation now faced the reality that his selfish behavior had caused genuine suffering to someone who had dedicated his life to serving others. The international media coverage evolved from satirical reporting about tourist misbehavior to serious journalism about military service, terminal illness, and the true meaning of honor and sacrifice. Morrison's story became a powerful counterpoint to Marcus's entitlement, highlighting the difference between genuine character and mere wealth. Palace officials worked frantically to organize the private ceremony that would give Morrison the dignified farewell he deserved. The logistical challenges were enormous, as they needed to create a meaningful military tribute while maintaining the privacy necessary to protect Morrison's family from the media circus that continued to surround the original incident. The Scottish village where Morrison's grandmother lived rallied around their local hero, organizing fundraisers and support networks for both Morrison and his family as they faced the difficult months ahead. The incident had transformed the quiet Highland community into part of an international story about duty, honor, and the price of selfless service. Marcus's business empire in New York continued to crumble as the full story of Morrison's situation became known. Clients who might have forgiven a moment of tourist embarrassment could not forgive behavior that had caused genuine harm to a terminally ill soldier. The wealthy developer who had built his success on aggressive self-promotion now found that same visibility destroying everything he had worked to create. The contrast between the two men at the center of the story became a powerful symbol for broader social and moral discussions. Morrison, facing the end of his career and his health, maintained his dignity and sought only a private moment of honor with his family. Marcus, with all the advantages that wealth could provide, had used his privilege to demand special treatment and had inadvertently destroyed something precious and irreplaceable. Support for Morrison and his family began pouring in from around the world as people learned about his situation. Military organizations, veterans groups, and ordinary citizens who were moved by his story began organizing tributes, fundraisers, and expressions of gratitude that demonstrated the global respect for his service and sacrifice. The psychological impact on Marcus intensified as he realized the full scope of what his actions had cost Morrison and his family. The entitled tourist who had demanded the perfect photograph had instead created a permanent record of his own selfishness and its devastating consequences for an innocent person who deserved better treatment. Morrison's medical team worked to ensure that he could participate in the planned private ceremony despite his advancing condition. The neurological symptoms that were ending his career had not yet progressed to the point where he couldn't perform his duties one final time. But time was running short, and every day brought new challenges to his motor control and physical capabilities. The palace's preparation for Morrison's private ceremony became a mission of institutional redemption, an attempt to restore honor and dignity to a situation that had been contaminated by tourist entitlement and selfish behavior. The ceremony would represent everything that the original disrupted event should have been, a celebration of service, tradition, and the sacrifices made by those who dedicate their lives to protecting others. As the arrangements for the private ceremony neared completion, it became clear that this extraordinary gesture would represent more than just palace protocol. It would serve as a powerful statement about the values that truly mattered and the difference between earned honor and purchased privilege. The upcoming ceremony would provide Morrison with the dignified farewell he deserved while offering a profound lesson about respect, sacrifice, and the true meaning of character. The private ceremony for Guard James Morrison took place on a crisp autumn morning exactly 1 week after the incident that had changed so many lives. The setting was a small, private courtyard within the palace complex, away from public view, but no less dignified than the grand ceremonial spaces where the regular changing of the guard occurred. Queen Elizabeth herself attended, along with senior military officials, Morrison's immediate family, and a carefully selected honor guard of his fellow soldiers. Morrison stood in his pristine ceremonial uniform, every brass button polished to mirror brightness, every piece of trim perfectly aligned, representing the military precision and personal pride that had defined his service. His grandmother, Helen Morrison, sat in a place of honor, wearing her late husband's military medals and weeping with pride as she watched her grandson receive the recognition and dignity that had been stolen from him by Marcus's entitled behavior. The ceremony was brief but profoundly meaningful, incorporating traditional elements of military honor with personal touches that acknowledged Morrison's unique service and sacrifice. The Queen personally thanked him for his dedication, and his commanding officer presented him with commendations that recognized both his military service and his extraordinary composure during the humiliating incident that had made him internationally known. Meanwhile, Marcus Wellington had undergone his own transformation during the week following his disgraceful behavior. The viral humiliation and global condemnation had forced him to confront aspects of his character that he had never examined before. His wife Sarah had threatened to leave him unless he sought professional help to address his entitled attitude and selfish behavior, and Marcus had reluctantly agreed to begin working with a therapist who specialized in helping wealthy individuals overcome privilege-related behavioral problems. The therapy sessions were brutal for Marcus, as he was forced to examine how his wealth and success had gradually insulated him from normal social consequences and had fostered a sense of entitlement that ultimately led to his devastating public humiliation. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, his therapist, made it clear that real change would require Marcus to fundamentally alter his worldview and accept responsibility for the genuine harm his actions had caused. Marcus's business empire continued to suffer as clients and partners distanced themselves from the negative publicity. However, instead of fighting to preserve his reputation through legal threats and public relations campaigns, Marcus began to consider a different approach. The man who had always solved problems with money and aggression started to explore the possibility of making amends through genuine contrition and meaningful action. The international media coverage of Morrison's private ceremony created a powerful contrast with the original incident. Images of the dignified soldier receiving royal recognition for his service and sacrifice stood in stark opposition to the viral videos of Marcus's entitled meltdown and spectacular humiliation. The juxtaposition highlighted the difference between earned honor and purchased privilege in ways that resonated with audiences worldwide. Morrison's neurological condition continued to progress, but the dignity restored by the private ceremony gave him strength to face his declining health with grace and courage. His story inspired thousands of people around the world who were dealing with their own terminal diagnoses or caring for loved ones facing similar challenges. The guard who had been humiliated by a tourist's vomit became a symbol of resilience and dignity in the face of adversity. 3 months after the original incident, Marcus made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He announced that he was donating $10 million to establish a foundation supporting terminally ill military veterans and their families, with the first major grant going to ensure that Morrison and his grandmother would have financial security throughout his illness and her remaining years. The announcement was met with skepticism from many who viewed it as a calculated public relations move designed to rehabilitate Marcus's reputation. However, those closest to the situation, including Morrison's family and the palace officials who had worked with Marcus's representatives, recognized that his transformation appeared to be genuine and his commitment to making amends was sincere. Marcus insisted that the foundation be named the Morrison Military Health Foundation, ensuring that the Guard's name would be permanently associated with helping other soldiers facing similar challenges. He also established a strict policy that his own name would never appear in connection with the foundation's work, recognizing that his rehabilitation had to focus on genuine service rather than public recognition. The foundation's first major initiative involved creating specialized medical facilities for veterans dealing with rare neurological conditions like Morrison's. The program would provide cutting-edge treatment options and family support services that weren't available through traditional military healthcare systems. Morrison himself became involved in designing the programs, using his own experience to ensure that the foundation would address the real needs of affected veterans. Morrison's grandmother, Helen, initially refused to accept any financial assistance from Marcus, viewing it as an attempt to purchase forgiveness for unforgivable behavior. However, when she learned that the money would also help other military families facing similar challenges, she agreed to participate in the foundation's programs while maintaining her moral authority to criticize Marcus's original actions. The psychological transformation that Marcus underwent surprised even his therapist, who had expected him to resist genuine change and seek quick fixes for his reputation problems. Instead, Marcus demonstrated a willingness to examine his deepest character flaws and to accept that his wealth and status had corrupted his judgment and moral compass in ways that required fundamental correction. Sarah Wellington, who had been considering divorce in the immediate aftermath of the incident, found herself witnessing a version of her husband that she had never seen before. The arrogant, entitled businessman who had embarrassed her throughout their marriage was being replaced by someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding how his actions affected other people and in using his resources to address real problems. The viral videos of Marcus's humiliation continued to circulate on social media, but the narrative gradually evolved from simple ridicule to a more complex story about redemption, responsibility, and the possibility of genuine personal transformation. Educational institutions began using the incident as a case study in business ethics, cultural sensitivity, and the responsibilities that come with wealth and privilege. Morrison's fellow guardsmen, initially angry about the humiliation their colleague had suffered, gradually came to respect Marcus's efforts to make meaningful amends. The foundation's work with military veterans created tangible benefits for people they knew and cared about, demonstrating that Marcus's transformation was producing real results rather than just good publicity. The palace's handling of the entire situation became a model for crisis management and institutional grace under pressure. Their decision to provide Morrison with a dignified private ceremony, combined with their careful management of the media narrative, demonstrated how institutions could uphold their values while addressing unprecedented challenges with creativity and compassion. 1 year after the incident, Morrison's condition had progressed to the point where he could no longer perform military duties, but the foundation bearing his name had already helped hundreds of veterans and their families access specialized medical care and financial support. His story continued to inspire people facing terminal diagnoses, while Marcus's transformation offered hope for others seeking to overcome their own character flaws and entitled attitudes. The incident that had begun as a simple story of tourist misbehavior had evolved into something much more profound, a demonstration of how even the most humiliating personal failures could become catalysts for genuine growth, meaningful service, and positive change. Marcus's journey from entitled businessman to dedicated philanthropist showed that people were capable of fundamental transformation when confronted with the true consequences of their actions. Morrison's legacy extended beyond his military service to include his role in creating lasting change in how society addressed the needs of terminally ill veterans. The foundation that bore his name became a permanent memorial to his dignity and sacrifice, while also serving as a reminder that even the most negative incidents could produce positive outcomes when people chose to respond with courage, compassion, and commitment to genuine change. The final irony of the entire story was that Marcus, who had desperately sought the perfect photograph to impress his social media followers, ultimately found genuine fulfillment and respect through work that he insisted remain anonymous. The man who had once demanded special treatment because of his wealth learned to find meaning in service that brought him no public recognition, but created lasting benefits for people who truly deserved society's support and gratitude. Years later, when people remembered the incident of the entitled tourist who vomited on a royal guard, they also remembered the story of transformation and redemption that followed, proving that even the most embarrassing moments of human weakness could become sources of strength, wisdom, and positive change for everyone involved.